This lecture was given on the 10th of November 1977, and the title of this lecture is Why Analysis Works. Now, we covered last week in the lecture, we covered the various rules of an analyst, and you'll have a chance when that tape is transcribed to listen to it in your own time, and there'll also be some notes to go with the tape, so you've got both the notes and also the tape to listen to at your leisure. So the three parts of analysis that make analysis work are firstly the communication cycle. Now, you've both done the communication course, and an absolute essential part of analysis is to establish a good communication cycle between your client and yourself as the analyst. And we'll give you some training on how to achieve that, part of which was what we did in the practical last week. And the second reason analysis works is by use of a process. Now, that is a set method, a set discipline, which is allocated to you by the case analyst to run for this particular case. So the case is originally interviewed by the case analyst and then assigned to the analysts themselves, and your job is to take charge of the case and to actually listen to the person, the being. Now, you are not doing anything to the person's mind. What you are doing is going into communication, direct communication with the other being, and across that communication bridge between you as the analyst and the client comes the client's case, their confusions, their considerations, their doubts. And when the client starts a session, his subconscious mind is well to the fore. And the purpose of the session, this is the actual use of the process by the analyst, is to cause that subconscious mind to key out more and more and more. And during a session, during the running of the process by the analyst, you have got to look for good indicators on your client. And I'll give you a list of good indicators at the moment, and I'll give you a list of bad indicators. And the idea is to eliminate the bad indicators and to increase the number of good indicators. So if you know what the bad indicators are, you expect to see less of those as the case progresses. And if you know what the good indicators are, you expect to see more good indicators. So the process is assigned by the case analyst to the analyst to use on the case. And unfortunately, certainly with the lower level processes, they are standardized. We used to use a lot of processes, but now we've got down to just a few processes. So the case analyst will say, right, run this process until it's flat, which means until there's no communication lag coming from the client, until the client is answering the question which makes up the process. And these processes are steadily more difficult. So the client starts off with an easy process, and the processes get steadily more difficult as the case advances. So we have the analyst who is entering into a communication cycle with the client. Along that communication bridge, travels the client's case. And as the case is given to the analyst, so the subconscious mind will key out. Because all these lower levels are basically the keying out of the subconscious mind to bring in more good indicators with the client and less bad indicators. And that is this is done by applying the process to the client's case, by allowing the case to travel along the communication cycle. Do you follow what I mean by communication cycle between the client and the analyst? And we'll train you to set up a good and clean communication cycle. Because if the communication cycle goes out between the analyst and the client, you have an LAC break on your hands. And we also train you how to sort those out. So the client at that point has not only got an LAC break, probably with his wife, the husband, or life itself, they've also got an LAC break with you. So to get the case going again, you have to clean up the LAC break sometimes. If you do your job right, don't get too many of these LAC breaks. They can occur from time to time. So the communication bridge and also the process to be run on the client. And from time to time, the case analyst will review the case, either by seeing the client or by looking through the notes in order to decide when the process needs to be changed. And really, you never use a process for less than an hour. And one of the pitfalls you can fall into is to assume that a process is not working, or because you can't get a process to work sometimes, is to change the process. You don't change the process without the permission of the case analyst, which will be me for some time or whoever replaces me in the future. So we run the process until the case analyst decides the process is flat. Now, the third part of the resolution of the case is, of course, the case analysis, which is deciding when that particular process is flat and when the client has reached that stage in discovering what their problems are and exactly the points on their case which are causing this confusion, causing, in some cases, a psychosomatic illness, or causing some kind of psychological disarrangement or some psychological pressure, psychological stress, if you like. The case normally is one where there is some psychosomatic illness, some pressure like an ulcer or something like this, or where there is some psychological confusion, one or the other. Now, both the psychological confusion and all the psychosomatic is always caused by the actual impinging of that subconscious mind, either on the body or on the person's consciousness. And remember all the time, you are not treating the person's body, you're not even treating the person's mind, you aren't treating anything. What you're doing is putting yourself in a position to listen and to understand the being that is opposite you. So it is a question of you, the being, and the client, the being, who are forming a team to resolve the client's case. And the client's case is defined as his confusions and his doubts about himself, his relationships, and his life. And these doubts and these confusions are caused by the impinging of this subconscious mind. Because if you had a totally clear being whose subconscious mind was keyed out, then that person would have total certainness in their life, total confidence, and total peace of mind until that subconscious mind came back in again. Now, the higher states of analysis, which involve self-analysis, involve the total running out of the subconscious mind. But these people that come to see you on the low levels, they don't even realise they've got a subconscious mind. All they know is that there is something wrong in their life. Now, when you go into the deeper levels of analysis, you'll realise that ultimately all mankind's deepest problems are spiritual, to do with himself and the relation to the universe. The clients that come in here on a day-by-day basis, they've never heard of parapsychology. They've probably never heard of the word spiritual outside religion. And they're certainly not aware that they're looking for any deep spiritual truth, because their problems are really fall into four main categories. And these are A, communication problems. The difficulty in communicating their feelings and their thoughts, their view of their personality to somebody else. That is their fundamental, basic difficulty, a communication problem. So the first process that you run, in fact, clean up the communication difficulties that the client has. The part of the case involved in communication. And we've got processes which are very simple for that. And then after you've cleared up communication, the next thing that the client wants cleaned up is problems, personal problems in their lives. So that's part B, problems. And part C is guilt. And guilt is to do with justification of acts of commission or omission in the past. And we have a tape, in fact, on the mechanics of guilt, which was given on one of the Monday nights, and this tape will be available to you as part of this course. So the third stage is to clear up guilt. Things that the client or the being has done way back in their life which they feel guilty about and have tried to justify, or things that they didn't do which they should have done. So that's the third level of the case, and you've got to look at these cases rather like peeling onions. You take the first level off first. If you try to go too deep to start with, you can in fact bring about an LAC break, because you've tried to go too deep into the client's case too early. So start off with communications, then you come up to problems, then you come up to guilt, and after guilt, part D of the client's case is upsets, past upsets they've had throughout their life. And then you come on to the fifth part of the client's case, which is to do with the client being connected to other people in their life who are dominant personalities, people who are suppressing them, either right now, or people that have suppressed them and inhibited them in the past. You see, basically, by growing up with parents and by growing up with society, we're all subjected to brainwashing and hypnosis of some kind, because the whole basis of brainwashing is to condition people. You know this word, conditioning? Society is concerned to condition people to behave correctly. Parents are concerned with conditioning people to behave correctly, and everyone's concerned with conditioning process. And the whole of the conditioning process basically is involved with keying in the subconscious mind during this life, and all it is basically a hypnotic technique. So the person's got all these stuck points in their life where somebody's trying to condition them here, where somebody's trying to condition them there. Their parents, school, life in general, their early jobs, all been trying to shape their personality to somebody else's desire. So the person ends up feeling that they're not quite sure who they are. Are they their parents' a personality? Are they the personality that the school wanted to create? Are they the personality that society wanted to create? So if they are got to the state of awareness where they realise that there's something wrong in their life, ultimately it's because the true self is trying to come out. And the reason that they come in here basically is to find out who they really are. And you might find that surprising that people want to find out who they really are, but people don't know who they are because they have been subject to all this conditioning. And the first approach is to get them to communicate to you, to get them to communicate what they want to communicate. And in fact, the very basic process of the analyst is having sat the client down in front of them just to say one word, and that's start. So they come in a charged up state, the subconscious mind re-stimulation. They want to get all this off their chest. And quite often for the first hour, they will run quite nicely with all the good indicators in. And the type of things that are good indicators in a session is a nice colour in the person's cheeks. This is an indicative that the blood is flowing through the body nicely. They look slightly flushed. A bad indicator would be a client with a pale face, withdrawn face. Another good indicator is the client willing and able to talk to the analyst. Willing and able to talk to the analyst. And if your training, your basic training has gone correctly, then the client will automatically be willing and able to talk to the analyst. So basically, if the client is talking about himself or herself, about their case, this is a good indicator. A bad indicator would be the client not being willing to talk about their case. The client sitting there and looking into space and saying nothing. If some of you have seen these deep hypnotic analyst work where the client tenses up and goes through birth pangs and some of the things that you've seen with hypnotism here, that is not a good indicator. So the client jumping about in the chair is not a good indicator at all. It's far better to have the client quietly relaxed, quietly talking to you about themselves and not going through any of these intense dramatisations of anger or apathy. But you want to produce in the session some kind of mood change. You all remember your mood table, yes? Yes. Well, during the session, it's a good thing if the client is in fact changing his or her mood. So expect to see the moods of anger, the moods of apathy, the moods of enthusiasm coming and going throughout the session. What would be a bad indicator would be in fact the client having no change of mood during the session. The client comes in apathy, the client leaves in apathy. That case is not running properly. The cases that are running properly, there will be a constant change in mood. Another good indicator will be the client having some kind of realisation about their problems and about their confusions, stating to you in the session that they think that this is what they should be doing. They have some idea of what they should be doing. They have some idea of what they can do. So we've described this as the client having self-realisations. You see, the only real positive change that will be brought about with anybody is if they make a decision to change. Because all the conditioning in this world will only suppress people. It won't actually release people. It won't enable the personality to come out. So all decisions that the client makes, cognitions we call them, about himself and about his case, are very good indicators indeed. So there we have some of the good indicators in the session. Another good indicator is itches, aches and pains, the client having a scratch here, the client having a scratch there. These are points where the subconscious mind is actually electrically impinging on the body, and sometimes the client will get a pain with their psychosomatic during the session. So psychosomatics or itches coming and going during the session, that is a good indicator. So if the client is scratching and touching parts of their body as they are talking to you, these are in fact good indicators. It means that the subconscious mind is coming in, the subconscious mind is going out. And if they are freely talking to you about themselves and they are cognising about their case, they have a nice flush colour in their skin, and you've got itches and they are moving about in their chair, not excessively. I don't mean that they're jumping up and down walking around the room, but there's a certain amount of movement in the chair, whereas a bad indicator will be if they stick there in a fixed, rigid position, staring out into space. If that has happened, it's happening, in fact, you haven't got your communication cycle in. And one of the main faults of the analyst is not putting the communication cycle in. Because if that client thinks you in any way you are evaluating for them, not by what you say, but by the way you look at them, or if they think that you're invalidating them, making nothing of what they say, by your look or by your manner, then they will go into an LAC break. The case will cease to progress at that point. So the main thing that is out in a session of analysis is the communication cycle, not the process and not the case analysis. And the most difficult thing is the keeping in of the communication cycle. because that is a flow that exists between you and the other being. It is really almost a parapsychological effect. It's a complete rapport between you and the client, and it's the whole fundamental basis of analysis. It's almost a form of love at a distance. And the reason that we want people who are mature to be analysts is if you give this job to somebody who's about 20 years old, after the third case, there's a love relationship. The analyst will come in and say, I've fallen in love with my client. So a certain amount of maturity is required, because you are developing a form of love relationship, because it's a deep, intimate relationship between client and analyst. And the client will develop a form of rapport, a form of a deep affinity, a deep LAC with you. And quite often they will look up and tell you in the session that they feel that they're falling in love with you, in which case you acknowledge it, not in a way of feeling, oh, well, so you should, but in a way of acknowledgement that they are feeling this deep feeling for you. And if they do express a feeling for you, then at least you know you've got the LAC. But it's very important that when you end the session, you disconnect from the client. And this is something that we're training you to do, that at the end of the session, you put all thoughts of that client and all thoughts of what they said completely out of your mind. You make notes on your case folder, you close your case folder, you put the folder in the filing cabinet, and that is the end of session. And if the client, after the end of the session, starts to talk about themselves, then you indicate to them that the session is ended. And you show them out and show them down to reception or show them out the door. So in no way do you discuss the client's case out of session. So it's a privileged relationship which starts with the start of the session, finishes with the start of the session. The session is intended to bring in these good indicators, the impinging of the subconscious mind onto the client, and the outgoing of the subconscious mind is what it's all about. And in fact, we have got a meter which will help you with the case, because with this meter, the needle will float backwards and forwards. And if the needle is floating backwards and forwards, you know that your communication cycle is in, because this meter works by passing a small current from the battery through the body of the client. And if the session is going well, that electricity will flow around the client and the needle will float across the scale. And if you've got a stuck needle, it means that the client has not got the communication cycle in with you, and it's your responsibility to get the communication cycle into the session, and it means you've got an LAC break. So what this meter basically shows is if you have got an LAC break with the client, because all the thought of analysis is invariably not the process, not the case analysis, but the fact that the analyst has not got the communication cycle in with the client. And having the communication cycle in is what enables the LAC in the session to develop. And 75% of the analysis is developing a safe environment for the client to have his case analysed. And that is why there is no invalidation, there is no evaluation. You accept the client's data for what it is. So as the client sees it, so he sees it. Because he is wanting to use you as a mirror in order to find out who he is. And the way he does this is by explaining to you so that you have understood. Because understanding, if you remember the lecture on communication, means affinity plus reality plus communication. That equals understanding. So if you've got a lot of LAC in the session, then you've got total understanding. If you've got total understanding, then that client will have tremendous cognitions about their case and about the problems in their case, and the case will resolve itself very quickly. Because the only difference between you acting as an analyst and myself is not that you won't be able to do the job, but you probably take slightly longer. Because I would tend to go for the fundamental issues, whereas you may tend to get interested in the significance of the case. Because you sit down there, you see, and the client comes out with all these interesting things. Now, understanding the client and being interested are certainly related, but you mustn't get too wrapped up in the significance of the case. So if the client comes in and says, well, look, I've had 8 or 9 affairs, that may be socially interesting. But all you do is understand it, because the significance of the client's case is quite relevant. What the client's done, whether it's socially acceptable or unacceptable, will not resolve the client's case. All that will resolve the client's case is the client reaching decisions and understandings about how he wants to live his life. So the significance of the case we call tidbits of the case. And when you start as an analyst, you tend to get rather interested because you hear people in the raw, the way their lives really are, and you get tremendously fascinated with the detail. But you must not to concentrate too much on the detail. You have to listen to the detail and understand the detail. But what you must do is express acknowledgement and understanding, a compassion, if you like, of how the client has led his life up to this point. And remember that the being there is not a bad person at any time. It is a person who was born basically good and is striving to do the right thing in life, is trying to be a social being, and we know that the way to hell is paved with good intentions, but something can stop this client evolving, something can stop their personality evolving, and the reason they've come to you is to finalise a degree of maturity, to evolve, to find out who they really are. So the significance of the case can be an awful trap. So the things that we write down are not all the details of the case, of what the actual person's done. The things that you'll write down on your case folder is the topics of which the client is ready to talk about. So the fact that the client is talking about a particular subject, that is important, and not the content of the subject. So some of the things that you will hear will astound you, because you will hear for the first time a person telling the actual truth and not what you probably have expected things to be, but what actually happened in the person's actual thoughts at that time. So don't become interested and caught up in the significance of the case. Be willing to receive the client's case. Be willing to grant beingness to the client, to grant LAC to the client, to listen and to understand. But we're not interested in all the individual details being written down. What we are interested in is the topics that the client's willing to talk about. So it is significant if the client is talking about cats. It's not significant the fact that that particular cat has had 10 kittens. The subject is cats, so write down cats, because that is a topic that the case analyst knows that the client was willing to talk about. So we're looking for things that the client is willing to talk about, and not what they talk about. The significance is what they talk about. The case resolves itself because of the willingness of the client to talk about a particular topic, because that is the topic that brings the client out. You understand what I'm saying? So significance is quite irrelevant in the Institute. What the client is talking about is of relevance, but not what they say about it. So we'll train you what to write down on the case analyst reports and not what to write down. So all significance is irrelevant. What matters is whether the client is having cognitions, is making decisions about his life, and whether the good indicators are written, like skin tone, change of mood, client having itches and moving a bit. The body, you expect the body to move, and very often you'll get this sense of well-being yourself. As the client comes up the mood, you'll find that you will come up the mood. As the client goes down in mood, you will tend to go down in mood, but you've got to be very careful not to go into sympathy with the client, because you've not resolved the client's case. You start feeling sorry for the client. So the client says, "Well, look, I had this arm when I was 3 years old. I lost this in my arm, and all my problems." It's very easy to sit there and start to feel this arm, to develop a sympathy for the client. And now, if you start to reflect the client's mood too much, the client's case will not resolve, and you get an LAC break on your hand. You've got to take a neutral position of understanding, but you must allow the client to reflect his case along the communication cycle at you, but you mustn't change because the client changes. So if the client gets very angry and ups the table, you mustn't display any anger. You must let that anger pass through you. You must understand it, but you still sit there in the position of analysis, writing down whatever you have to write down. You write down by watching the client. So you watch the client, but you don't write down as the client talks. You write down the various topics and put circles around the things that the client's talking about, but not the significance. But you keep looking at the client, and you keep this posture of LAC understanding. You keep the communication cycle in, and whatever the client does, if the client gets angry or if the client gets antagonistic, you still stay there in your analyst, what we call your analyst personality, which is a distinct stance. The client won't ever hit you. The client won't ever actually. Client may come to within inches of you to get a point across, but the client won't actually do anything unless you do something. Sometimes, inadvertently, the client will try and get you involved in what he's saying. You never get involved. You never make any comment. You do anything else other than listen and write it down. You have to ask the question which composes the process as assigned by the case analyst, and then you wait for the answer. The client's answer might last half an hour, but you still wait there. And the important thing is that when the client is finished, you acknowledge. And you can use one of 5 acknowledgements in training: good, fine, thank you, okay, all right. Any of these simple acknowledgements, but you must end cycle when the client has finished speaking. You'll be very careful that you don't cut the client's communication cycle, because sometimes people speak and they finish and they haven't really finished. They've got something else which is quite important they've got to say. With experience, you'll develop and realise when the client has finished what he's saying. When you're sure that the client has finished what he's saying, you acknowledge it with a word of acknowledgement. So you cut that communication cycle. Or you don't cut the communication cycle, you end the communication cycle with a full stop. And the reason you do that is to let the client know that you have understood. because the client will stop talking when you have understood, and he will keep talking if you haven't understood. Now, there are certain key words that you can use to interrupt or clarify a point that the client's making, because you must never in a session pretend to understand if you haven't. So it's perfectly all right to say to the client things like, I haven't quite got that, if you genuinely haven't understood what the client's talking about. What you mustn't do is to pretend to understand if you don't, because very quickly the client will pick it up and you have an LAC break on your hands, and you cannot resolve an LAC break with communication. You have to locate the LAC break, go back to that point, clean that LAC break up and start all over again, which can take time. And the client is paying a fee, and the client doesn't want you to take time. The client wants his case or her case resolved as quick as possible. So be very careful not to interrupt the client's stream of thought, but you can say to the client, well, I haven't quite. You don't use the word understand, because if you say I haven't understood that, the client might think you've understood nothing, but you use words like, well, I haven't quite got that. Could you please explain that a little more to me? In other words, be interested in understanding, and don't try and fool the client by pretending that you haven't understood, because the client, almost telepathically, will pick up that you haven't understood. And the client will feel very insulted if you're pretending to understand and you haven't. So make quite sure that you understand what the client's saying, and you can interrupt to the extent of asking the client to explain that point further. But when the client has finally finished your answer to your original question, the question that makes up the process, then you acknowledge the client with one of the acknowledgements like good, thank you, fine, okay. So the client will then go, like that, and will realise that you have understood, and you know that that part of the process, or part of the question which makes up the process, is finished. And some of the processes involve asking another question, and some of the processes have only got one question. But you must acknowledge what the client says. If you remember in the communication course, we talked to you a little bit about acknowledgements, and you'll certainly do some more practicing in the practical on how to acknowledge somebody, because an acknowledgement is a full stop to let the client know that you have understood precisely what they've been saying. Do you follow that? Yes. So to quickly summarise what we've covered in this tape, the three parts of analysis are the communication cycle, of which 80% of the session of analysis is composed, the process as assigned by the case analyst, and the role of the case analysis, which is the reviewing of the case, which may involve seeing the client and may not involve seeing the client. If those three things are operating precisely, the client's case will resolve, and most of the clients who come in, what we call raw meat from the public, have really got either a communication problem, a personal problem in their life they wish to resolve, guilt, which is hanging them up, upsets in their life which are unresolved, and finally the connection to these dominant personalities, which I've covered in another tape, which will be assigned as part of this course. And you're really resolving those four parts of the client's case. Ultimately, the client's case is spiritual and almost parapsychological in nature, but these clients have got these things on top of their cases, and they haven't even got that far, and they might not even know anything about those subjects. They're only concerned with getting through each day because of the confusions of either psychosomatic illnesses or psychological confusions in their life that they wish to resolve. There's a doctor in this town which puts a notice over his door: I'm not a marriage guidance counsellor, I'm not a psychiatrist, I cannot lower your rent. If you haven't got anything physically wrong with me, what's wrong with you, please don't come and see me. Now, that is a doctor who's honest. He knows that he can only hands into the time state. And in fact, all our interchange of ideas are done through the symbols of words. You have the concept, I have the concept, I have the concept of the subject. By putting it over in a different way, by using different words, I'm hitting you with these words. And these words you're receiving through the three dimensions of space and one of time, because since I started this lecture, a certain amount of time has passed. There is space, there is distance between us, three-dimensional space, planes of space, vertical, horizontal, and crossways. And I am translating the concept that I'm trying to get over you with these lectures. I'm translating those into the symbols of words, which I'm sending through the physical world as sound vibrations. I'm using heavy words, I'm using long words, I'm using high words, I'm using low words. Those words have got colour, they've got taste. I'm sending the words across to you, and you are receiving the words, and they are triggering off in your consciousness a whole load of concepts and a whole load of ideas. Those ideas that you actually get triggered off from those symbols are abstractions. They are timeless. They don't exist in the physical world. The words exist in the physical world. The words do. But the ideas that they trigger off are abstract and timeless and don't form part of this universe at all. And the ideas I'm trying to put across to you also don't form part of this physical world. And how I get the ideas across is to translate them into words, which are symbols, send the symbols across, and they will, to some extent, trigger off concepts in your consciousness. Concepts you already know, actually. All I'm doing is telling you what you already know by defining it scientifically, defining language, defining ideas and concepts which man has not understood for some time. I'm defining them just like mathematics, saying, right, LAC triangle. If you're getting on with somebody, it's because you like them, because you agree with them, because you communicate with them, and vice versa. You'll see that this works. You can demonstrate it. It's definite. It's not why some people don't get on with others. There are definite reasons why people don't get on. So the symbols are how I'm trying to communicate with you. But if you don't understand the words that I'm using, or you don't understand the symbols that I'm trying to get off, they will cause these concepts to be cloudy. They will cause you to lose interest in the subject, and they could even cause you to go away from the course if you don't understand. So by misuse of words, you can confuse people, and the trouble with the education system is that children quite often, with a subject, misunderstand the words. They misunderstand the symbols of their subject, so they lose interest in the subject, and mathematics is a wonderful example of this. Mathematics, badly taught at the infant school, the wrong use of number, the wrong use of the symbols, causes a complete disinterest in the subject later on. And people just say, I don't like maths, I can't do maths. What they're saying is, I didn't understand the basic symbols. I didn't understand the basic concept of number way back in the infant school. So words can have two effects. They can create a re-stimulation of the subconscious mind because you don't understand them, because you cannot interpret the symbols, or misuse of a word between two people can create a misunderstanding which can cause the two parties to go out of communication with one another. And if you wanted to get two parties back into communication, all you've got to do is locate the misunderstanding, not talk to the person, but go back to the point where the LAC break occurred and find out what they didn't understand at that point. And you could then repair the LAC between two people. And if people are disinterested in subjects like these subjects or any academic subject, go back to the time that they read a book or read a lecture note where there was a word where there was no understanding. And then they would develop and redevelop an interest in that subject. Because all study is to do with words. If you can't understand the words of the subject, and I think you've had this problem dramatically from what I can see, passing over words you didn't understand, which has caused you to say, I cannot understand it, I cannot do it. So if in these lectures or in these notes we use words that you don't understand, well then ask me what they mean or ask Dawn what they mean, and we try and clean up the misunderstanding on the word and therefore the misunderstanding on the subject. But people have got these words already in their subconscious mind, and the interaction of a word that they misunderstand and a word in their subconscious mind pulls their subconscious mind on them, bang. And you know when somebody's sitting in their subconscious mind because the LAC triangle collapses. Somebody who has an LAC break has a subconscious mind in on them. And the subconscious mind is like an electrical field. If you could see the aura of a person who had an LAC break, that aura would be solid, it would be rigid, the colours would be rigid and dark, because the LAC break would cause a collapse of an electrical field because something is actually coming on a person. When somebody feels angry because of an LAC break, when somebody's in a row with somebody, this charge they feel charged up, and they feel charged up because this electrical field is coming on them. In fact, we've got a meter here, which we haven't quite finished building yet, but it is a meter which will, in fact, locate all the LAC breaks that you've had in your lifetime and clear up every misunderstanding you've had with any person this life, and also any words that you haven't understood, because this meter will measure this electrical field that comes in on you, and you will see the needle in the meter rise, and when the needle rises, you know the electrical field is coming on you, and by locating and prodding around in somebody's mind, you can locate all these LAC breaks. This is all the upsets you've had in your life, and if you would find out the reason for all the upsets in your life, then you will feel a far better person, because you will have located the things that have upset you right the way through your life. And that's one of the things we do in the personality rehabilitation, which is what is done during the day, and what you'll learn all about if you go through and do the second course, at least the theory of it. So there's a saying that sticks and stones may break my bones, but words never hurt me. That is a fallacy, because words can hurt you, words can kill you. There's certain word sequences you could use with people which will drive them insane, and which will drive them to the point where they just wanted to die. Just by using certain words in certain ways, if the person has what's what I'm looking for? If they've got a word sequence already in their subconscious mind, and you use another word sequence, you can bring in their own word sequences and destroy them with them. So words can be used terribly destructively, and you'll find that in techniques that involve brainwashing, they all involve word sequences, people saying the same thing over and over again to people until eventually they have a LAC break and get very upset, and then their interrogators become very friendly with them, so they then feel a communication swelling up with the interrogator, so that the person who's being interrogated will tend to adopt the beliefs, the religion, or the fanatical doctrine of the interrogator. And that is why people in Korean camps in the war, the Americans and the English who were captured, quite often became communists, and they went on the radio and broadcast to look, we're now communists. And the technique used was to use word sequences over and over again these people until they had LAC break after LAC break after LAC break, and then to withdraw, and then to reapproach these people. And as they don't know how to talk to, they'd start to talk to the interrogator, form a liking for the interrogator, trying to agree with their interrogator, communication with their interrogator, eventually adopting the doctrinal beliefs of the interrogator and being converted to the opposite camp. And this was all done by a sequence of words. So words, in fact, can be used destructively, or they can be used constructively. And remember that a lot of words in our language have no meaning in themselves, but they are colloquial words, or they're tribal words, or even if you take things like vulgar words or swear words, people get very emotional about these words, certain words you can use, because they react to the word like that. They react to the word, they don't think about what the word means, because the word is just a bubble of emotion which is thrown at somebody. All swear words are emotions. They are the conveying, not of concepts, but the conveying of a pure emotion. And if you go into the East End of London and you go into Petticoat Lane and you start shouting the word yid, you're liable to get misunderstood, because to a Jew, that is a derogatory word. It's just Y-I-D. It means nothing to the person who's uttering it, but to somebody who's had 4,000 years of persecution and for 400 generations, and that word has been used, it's so ingrained in his subconscious mind, it's written across in neon letters. And if you say the word yid, all you do is light up the neon signs, and within a few seconds the chat will come to your throat, because you've used a word to stimulate somebody. And there are lots of words like this, local words, colloquial words, or tribal words, which can be used to stimulate people and cave them in. So don't use these words, because if you use these words, you're going to cause LAC breaks. You're going to lose a lot of friends. So be careful to avoid these words which are used destructively, and try to use language purely in the conscious sense to communicate something. And don't use language and words to communicate emotions. If you want to communicate emotions, you can demonstrate these emotions, you can feel these emotions, but don't try and use words to communicate emotions, because that's a sure way of causing LAC breaks. It's a sure way of losing a lot of friends. So we've covered communication and the definition of communication. We've covered the mechanics of communication, the LAC triangle, and we've also covered the parts of communication. That's the attention part and the duplication part. And we're now going to do the practical and demonstrate these things on each other, so that you know that they work, and so you know it's just not a lot of theory. So that's the end of this lecture. This lecture was recorded by Peter Goodwin, all copyright reserved. Thank you.